Imagine a prehistoric campfire 14,000 years ago. A hunter-gatherer crushes some wild grass seeds between stones, mixes the gritty powder with water, and leaves the paste on a hot rock near the fire. Hours later, they return to find a flat, hardened disc. It's edible. It's filling. It's the first bread. This wasn't a planned experiment. It was a lucky accident. But that accident would change. Bread became a portable, storable food that fueled migrations, built civilizations, and eventually transformed into the staff of life for empires. From the Fertile Crescent to the Nile Valley, early farmers learned to cultivate wheat and barley, turning wild grains into reliable crops. Bread was no longer an accident. It was a foundation. In ancient Egypt, bread was more than food. It was currency, religious offering, and a symbol of life. Workers building the pyramids were paid in bread and beer. The Egyptians mastered leavened bread, using wild yeast to create light, airy loaves. This innovation spread across the Mediterranean, becoming a staple of Greek and Roman diets. By the Middle Ages, bread had become a marker of social class. The wealthy ate fine white bread made from sifted flour, while peasants ate dark, coarse loaves of rye or barley. Bakers were regulated by strict laws to prevent cheating. Bread was so central that it gave us the word companion, from Latin cum panis, meaning with bread. The bread was found in a stone fireplace, carefully preserved by the dry desert conditions. It wasn't a loaf like we know today, but a flat, unleavened bread made from wild cereals like einkorn wheat and barley. The crumbs were tiny, but they held a hue. To confirm the age, researchers used radiocarbon dating on the charred crumbs. The results were astonishing. 14,400 years old. This pushed back the invention of bread by more than 4,000 years, long before the first farmers planted a single. This discovery changed our understanding of early human societies. It suggested that bread making might have been a driving force for agriculture, not just a result of it. People may have started farming because they already loved bread. The Cloaca Maxima bread also showed that early hunter-gatherers had sophisticated food processing skills. They could grind grains, mix dough, and bake on hot stones. This was not a simple accident. It was a deliberate recipe passed down through generations. First farmers planted a single seed. The bread was made from wild ancestors of modern wheat and barley, as well as tubers from an aquatic plant. The Natufian people, a hunter-gatherer culture, had figured out how to process and bake these ingredients into a flatbread. This discovery pushed back the earliest known bread by thousands of years. It showed that bread making was not a consequence of farming, but a precursor to it. People were making bread long. The Natufian bread was not a fluffy loaf like we know today. It was a flat, dense, unleavened bread, similar to a modern pita or tortilla. The flour was coarse, mixed with water, and then baked on hot stones or in the embers of a fire. This simple process produced a nutritious, portable food that could be stored for days. It was a game changer for nomadic hunter-gatherers, allowing them to carry a stable food. But the Natufians were not farmers. They were hunter-gatherers who lived in semi-permanent settlements. They harvested wild grains and tubers, but they did not deliberately plant seeds. The shift to farming happened gradually over thousands of years, as people began to notice that seeds dropped near their camps would sprout into new plants. This accidental observation eventually led to the first intentional planting, marking the beginning of agriculture. This transition from gathering to farming was not a sudden revolution. It was a slow, unconscious process. People selected the plants with the largest seeds, the easiest to harvest, and the most resistant to disease. Over generations, these plants became dependent on humans for their survival. Wheat and barley, for example, evolved to have non-shattering heads, meaning the seeds stayed on the stalk until harvest. This genetic change was a direct result of human selection, and it marked the true single plant. But the Cloaca Maxima bread is not the only ancient evidence. Similar finds have emerged from sites in Europe and Africa, suggesting that bread making was a widespread skill among prehistoric hunter-gatherers. The Natufians who made that bread were not farmers. They lived in semi-permanent settlements, hunting gazelles and gathering wild grains. But bread may have been the very thing that pushed them toward agriculture. Bread is labor-intensive. To make it, you need to harvest, thresh, grind, and bake. But the effort may have been worth it. Bread is portable, storable, and nutritious. It could be carried on long hunts or traded with neighboring groups. Over time, the demand for grain grew. Hunter-gatherers began to protect wild wheat fields, weeding out competitors and encouraging growth. They started to select the largest seeds for replanting. This was not yet farming, but it was a step toward it. The Natufians were becoming attached to their grain patches. They built stone foundations for their huts, indicating a more settled lifestyle. And they made more and more, but then the climate changed. Around 11,000 years ago, the younger Dryas cold period ended and the climate became warmer and wetter. This was good for wild grains which spread across the Fertile Crescent, but it also brought a population boom. More people meant more mouths to feed. The old ways of hunting and gathering could not keep up. The Natufians and their neighbors faced a choice: intensify their gathering of wild grains or find a way to produce more food. They chose both. They began to sow seeds deliberately, to irrigate, and to store surplus grain. This was the birth of agriculture. The first farmers did not abandon hunting overnight. They became part-time farmers, part-time hunter-gatherers. But over generations, the balance shifted. Domesticated plants and animals required constant care. Fields needed weeding, animals needed herding. People settled down permanently. Villages grew into towns, and bread, once a rare treat, became a daily staple. The simple act of making bread had set in motion a revolution that would change the course of human history. From a handful of wild grains to the first loaves, bread had transformed our ancestors from wanderers to settlers. The payoff is huge, a concentrated source of calories that can be stored for months. This created a powerful incentive to secure a steady supply of grain. When wild grain supplies became unreliable due to climate change at the end of the last ice age, people began to manage and eventually cultivate the most productive plants. The first farmers selected seeds from plants with larger grains and non-shattering heads. This process of domestication took centuries. But the goal was clear: more grain. For more bread. In the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 years ago, humans began to plant and harvest einkorn, emmer, and barley. Bread didn't just feed people, it reshaped society. Surplus grain allowed for population growth, specialization, and trade. Villages grew into towns and towns into cities. Bread became the foundation of the first civilizations. In ancient Mesopotamia, bread was central to daily life. Rations of bread and beer were paid to workers. The Sumerians had over 30 words for different types of bread, reflecting its importance. Temples and palaces operated large bakeries that produced bread for the gods, the king. Bread also had deep religious significance. In Egypt, offerings of bread were made to the gods, and loaves were placed in tombs to sustain the dead in the afterlife. The Egyptians developed advanced baking techniques, using yeast to leaven their bread, creating lighter, more flavorful loaves. The Greeks and Romans further refined bread making. In Rome, bakers formed guilds, and bread was distributed to the populace as a political tool, the famous bread and circuses. The Roman army's reliance on bread helped spread wheat cultivation and baking techniques across Europe. Of bread, it was both a staple and a symbol. But these early breads were all flat and dense. They were made from crushed grains and water, baked on hot stones or in embers. They resembled modern tortillas or pita. Leavened bread, the light and airy kind, came much later. The discovery of leavening was another accident. Perhaps a batch of dough was left out, and wild yeast from the air or from the grain itself caused it to ferment. When baked, this fermented dough produced a lighter, more voluminous bread. It had a different texture and flavor. This was a revolutionary change. Bread became a cornerstone of civilization. It fueled armies, fed cities, and even served as a form of payment. The simple act of mixing grain and water had transformed human society. The first leavened bread was born. No one knows exactly where or when leavened bread was first made. But the earliest clear evidence comes from ancient Egypt, around 4,500 years ago. Egyptian bakers mastered the art of fermentation. They used a starter culture, a piece of fermented dough saved from the previous batch, to consistently leaven their bread. This was the ancestor of modern. Egyptian bread came in many shapes: conical, round, braided. These loaves were often baked in clay ovens or on hot stones, and they formed a staple of the Egyptian diet. This mastery of leavening was a turning point in human food history. It transformed bread from a dense flatbread into a light, airy staple that could be stored longer and shared more. Bread was so important in Egypt that it was used as currency. Workers building the pyramids were paid in bread and beer. The Egyptian word for bread, ta, was also the word for life. Egyptian bakers also developed the first enclosed ovens. Instead of baking on hot stones, they built clay ovens that could reach high temperatures and bake multiple loaves at once. This was a major technological, but leavened bread was not limited to Egypt. By 3,000 years ago, it had spread to other civilizations around the Mediterranean. The Greeks, for instance, adopted Egyptian baking techniques and added their own innovations, such as using wine or honey to flavor the dough, had spread across the Mediterranean and into Europe. Each culture adapted it to local grains and tastes. The ancient Greeks elevated bread making to an art. They developed more than 70 types of bread, from simple barley cakes to elaborate wheat loaves flavored with honey. The Greeks also introduced the concept of professional bakers. In Athens, bakeries became common, and bread was sold in the agora. The word bakery itself comes from the Greek bak, but it was the Romans who truly industrialized bread production. They built large public bakeries, often powered by water mills. The Roman army demanded massive quantities of hardtack, a durable biscuit that could be stored for months. Roman bakers, often slaves or freedmen, organized into guilds. They perfected the art of leavened bread using sourdough starters. By the height of the empire, Rome had over 300 bakeries, and bread was a staple of every meal, from the poorest plebeian to the wealthy. Romans who truly industrialized bread. They built large public bakeries, often powered by water mills. Roman bakers used a variety of grains and developed new techniques for grinding and sifting flour. The Roman army relied on bread as a key ration. Soldiers carried portable ovens and could bake fresh bread on campaign. This helped spread Roman bread-making techniques across After the fall of Rome, bread-making knowledge was preserved in monasteries. Monks continued to bake, often using sourdough starters which they carefully maintained over generations. These monastic bakeries became centers of innovation, experimenting with different grains and fermentation times. Were passed down for generations. In medieval Europe, bread remained the centerpiece of the diet. The quality of bread reflected social status. The wealthy ate fine white bread, while peasants ate dark, coarse loaves made from rye. Bread was also used as a plate. Stale bread, called a trencher, was used to hold meat and sauce. After the meal, the trencher was often given to the poor or fed to dogs. The Industrial Revolution transformed bread once again. In the 19th century, roller mills replaced traditional stone grinding, producing fine white flour cheaply. Bread became whiter, softer, and available to all classes. In the 20th century, sliced bread was introduced in 1928, and it became a symbol of modern convenience. Today, bread is a global staple, with countless varieties from baguettes to naan, each telling a story of culture and history. In the 19th century, roller mills replaced traditional stone grinding, producing finer, whiter flour that became the standard for industrial bread. Commercial yeast replaced traditional sourdough starters, allowing bread to rise faster and more consistently, but sacrificing complex flavor. The invention of sliced bread in 1928 was hailed as the greatest forward step in the baking industry, making bread convenient and standardized. Today, industrial bread is often criticized for its lack of nutrition and flavor, as the focus on efficiency and shelf life has stripped away much of what made bread wholesome. At the same time, there is a revival of traditional methods, sourdough, whole grains, and ancient grains. To understand bread, we need to understand its ingredients: flour, water, salt, and a leavening agent. But the magic happens at the molecular level. When flour is mixed with water, two proteins, glutenin and gliadin, combine to form gluten. Gluten gives dough its elasticity and strength, trapping the gases produced by fermentation. Yeast, a single-celled fungus, consumes sugars in the dough and produces carbon dioxide. Alcohol, this process called fermentation, creates the air bubbles that make bread light and airy. The type of flour also matters. Whole wheat flour contains the entire grain kernel, including the bran and germ, which add fiber, nutrients, and a nutty flavor. White flour, on the other hand, is made only from the endosperm, giving a softer texture but less nutrition. Ancient grains like spelt, einkorn, and emmer have gained popularity for their distinct flavors and perceived health benefits. Sourdough bread uses a natural starter instead of commercial yeast. The starter is a symbiotic culture of wild yeast and lactic acid bacteria. These bacteria produce lactic acid, which gives sourdough its tangy flavor and also helps preserve the bread naturally. The long fermentation process in sourdough breaks down gluten and phytic acid, making nutrients more available. This is why many people who are sensitive to commercial bread find sourdough easy. Ancient grains like spelt, einkorn, and emmer are making a comeback. These grains have been cultivated for thousands of years and are often grown with fewer pesticides. They have a different gluten structure, which some people tolerate better. Spelt has a slightly sweet, nutty flavor. Einkorn is the oldest wheat variety, with a high protein content and a rich, buttery taste. Emmer, also known as farro, is a staple of Italian cuisine, used in soups and salads. These grains connect us to the gas forms bubbles, which are held by the gluten network. This is what makes bread rise. During baking, the heat kills the yeast, the alcohol evaporates, and the gluten sets. The crust forms through the Maillard reaction, creating the brown color and complex flavor. The same basic chemistry has been at work for thousands of years. From the first accidental flatbread to the perfect sourdough, bread is a testament to human ingenuity and the power of a simple accident. From the first accidental flatbread to the perfect sourdough, bread is a testament to human ingenuity and the power of a simple accident.